Okay, calm down.
You referred to October 7th as a prison break and not, quote, not terribly surprising. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, what was going on in Gaza is that up until 2005, well, let me go back a little bit further. Uh, the Israelis gained control of Gaza in 1967. As a result of the famous 67 war, Israel got control of the West Bank and Gaza. And from 1967 until 2005, the Israelis occupied Gaza. They had settlers in Gaza, and they had a large contingent of military forces in Gaza. But the place was a hornet's nest. And they were more concerned, the Israelis were more concerned about the West Bank, about the occupation of the West Bank, which they wanted to not only maintain, but expand. So, what Ariel Sharon did in 2005 is he pulled out of Gaza. He pulled all of the settlers and the military out of Gaza. Now, Israel's defenders today like to argue that what the Israelis were doing was presenting uh, the Palestinians in Gaza with a wonderful opportunity to turn it into Dubai and on the Mediterranean and live happily ever after. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Israelis continued to control Gaza's borders. They continued to control the air above Gaza, and they continued to control its water supply, and so forth and so on. And then in 2007, remember the Israelis pull out in 2005. In 2007, Hamas takes control in Gaza, and the Israelis really turn the screws on Hamas. And over the course of the time from roughly 2005 up until uh, now, people have come to argue that Gaza is an open air prison, that the Palestinians who live in Gaza are basically prisoners. It's an absolutely horrible life. And the Israelis go to great lengths to make it that way. So, this is why when Palestinians, and here we're talking about Hamas and a handful of other resistance groups in Gaza, broke out on October 7th, it was referred to as a prison break.
Just going back to that point you made about the disengagement or pulling out of Gaza, which people like to point to as a sign of generosity on Israel's part and an example of why Palestinians can't rule themselves. I wanted to just show this article from The Guardian. And here we have Ariel Sharon's chief aide making some honest statements about what was really behind this. He said, when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with authority and permission, all with the presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. And he calls the disengagement, he says the disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. So,
I remember it very well. It was Dove Weinglass, and
yeah,
he said that they were basically putting the Palestinians in formaldehyde. Uh,
yeah,
and I mean, this is a lot like the claims that Israel has wanted to give the Palestinians a state of their
right,
own. And they've offered the Palestinians a viable state on numerous occasions, and the Palestinians have
right.
turned it down and turned to terror at every turn. This is, this is a story that can't be supported by the evidence. Period. And the same thing is true with regard to Gaza.
Right.
The Israelis had no interest in turning Gaza into Dubai on the Mediterranean. In fact, what they wanted to do was, put the Palestinians in Gaza in a giant prison and inflict massive pain on them.
You've called Israel an apartheid state, which I obviously have done too, and I got fired for saying that. But you've called Israel an apartheid state, and you've said that they're engaging in genocide. And you actually called Netanyahu, you said about Netanyahu that he was basically he basically represents Jim Crow. So can you expand on that?
Well, those are three different issues. Let's just take them in
Sure.
turn. With regard to whether or not Israel is an apartheid state, anybody who has any doubt about that should read the Human Rights Watch report, the Amnesty International report, and the B'Tselem report on this very issue. Uh, these are extensive reports, thoroughly documented, done by extremely competent and honest and smart individuals. And I don't see how anybody could come away from reading those reports without thinking that Israel is an apartheid state. I would
Well, they'll
also
say that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are anti-Semitic. That's what some people say. It gets harder though when you throw in B'Tselem, which I guess would be self-loathing according to the logic of people who call those organizations anti-Semitic.
well, as you know, the term anti-Semitic is thrown around so
Of course,
loosely
yeah.
that
Right.
anybody who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite. I
Right.
know that you and I are both well-known
Right.
anti-Semites.
Yes.
It's just it's kind of crazy where
It
we
is
are.
now. The nice thing about B'Tselem is it makes it a little bit harder to write off that claim as anti-Semitic.
Look, I could give you a list of probably about 8 Israeli
Right.
senior figures who have said Israel is an apartheid state.
Right.
This is an argument that
Yeah.
you hear in Israel quite often. Uh, Bishop Tutu, right, who, of course, lived in apartheid South Africa, came to Israel and said it was an apartheid state. He and others like Ronnie Kasrils, who was a very prominent South African Jew, who was a major force during the apartheid era in South Africa. He and Bishop Tutu both said that what you saw in Israel, what they saw in Israel, was worse than apartheid in South Africa.
Right.
So there's just a whole slew of people outside of those three reports
Right.
who back up what those three reports conclude. Now, before I go to the whole subject of genocide, let's just talk about the Jim Crow charge. What I was talking about there was the claim that many Israelis and Israel's supporters, many of Israel's supporters make that we share values. Okay, that, in other words, the United States of America and Israel have the same values. And the point I was making is the only values that we share with the Israelis are old values
Right.
that are thankfully now gone, which dominated mainly in the South after the American Civil War and up to the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that's when Jim Crow America was alive and well in the South, and even to some extent in the North, to be honest. But anyway, Israel today is basically the equivalent of the Jim Crow South. That's certainly true in the West Bank and in Gaza. We could argue what it looks like inside Green Line Israel, where it's not quite as bad as in those two other places. But anyway, that's the context in which I brought up the Jim Crow analogy. And again, I was talking about apartheid.
Aaron Mate and I interviewed Chaz Freeman, and he's compared Israel's ideology to the KKK's ideology. So
It's amazing what's happened to Israel. I find it very hard to believe. I mean, I was someone who, I came of age in the 1950s, and my whole view of Israel was deeply informed by Leon Uris's famous book, Exodus.
that's it.
I had a very romantic view of Israel, and I thought that the Israelis were clearly the good guys, and that the Palestinians, or the Arabs, as people called them at the time, were the bad guys. And it's amazing the extent to which people like me and many other people I've known have fundamentally changed their view of Israel. And there are a number of factors that explain that. But what Israel has become, and you see this manifested in the war in Gaza, it's just really hard to believe. Um, but anyway, that's where we are. Let me say a few words about genocide.
Yeah, please.
Uh, I think that if you look at the South African report that was submitted to the ICJ, and I think 84 pages long, thoroughly documented, a really well done report on what the Israelis were doing in Gaza as of late December 2023. You want to remember that they sent their report to the ICJ in late 2023. And then it was in January 2024 that the ICJ, based on that report and all sorts of other pieces of information, the ICJ said there was sufficient evidence to make the case that there was a plausible uh, case, to make a plausible case that Israel was committing genocide. Uh, and if you look at what Israel has done since January 2024, it has in no way taken its foot off the accelerator. It's continued to pound um, Gaza, and it's not surprising that South Africa has intervened again with the ICJ because they were so disturbed by what's been happening since the ruling. But anyway, I paid careful attention to the report, the South African report. I listened to all the testimony, and I've been studying the issue myself. And I think when you look at what is necessary uh, to prove genocide and you look at what the Israelis are doing, I think it's hard not to conclude they're engaged in genocide. And I think that eventually the ICJ, when they resolve it once and for all, will reach the conclusion that this is genocide.
Because we were blessed with so much time with Professor Mearsheimer, some of this will be Patreon only. So to see the full stream with Professor Mearsheimer, please become Patreon supporters at patreon.com/the Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/the Katie Halper Show. So you can hear his thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, and World War.